The sun hung low over the small town, casting long shadows on the quiet streets. A black Navy veteran was driving through, heading toward a nearby city for a short break from a long journey. He had just finished a few days of visiting old friends and wanted nothing more than to stretch his legs and grab a cold drink before continuing on. He pulled into a gas station, the kind with a small convenience store. A few pumps outside, and the faint smell of gasoline mixing with fried food from a nearby diner. He parked and stepped out of his truck, taking a deep breath of the late afternoon air. The moment was calm, ordinary, the kind of break anyone could need while traveling. As he reached for the door to the store, a police car rolled slowly into the lot. The officer inside seemed to notice him immediately. The veteran did not pay much attention at first, thinking the officer was just passing by. But the car stopped near his truck, and the officer got out, walking toward him with a purposeful stride. There was something in the way the officer looked at him that made the veteran pause. He had faced challenges before, dangerous ones, even life-threatening. But there was a tension in this moment that felt different, sharper. The officer didn't greet him in the usual way. Instead, he leaned slightly forward and asked why he was there. His tone was hard, questioning, and it carried an assumption that something was wrong. The veteran stayed calm, hands relaxed at his sides, trying to give nothing that could escalate the situation. He explained simply that he was just stopping to grab a drink and some snacks. The officer's eyes narrowed and he took a step closer. He kept repeating questions, each one sharper than the last, each one implying suspicion without reason. People in the parking lot began to notice. Some were filling up their tanks, others just walking by. A few paused, sensing the tension in the air. The veteran kept his voice even, answering honestly. He showed his ID when asked, mentioning briefly that he had served in the Navy. The officer barely glanced at it, making a comment that it didn't matter much to him. His focus seemed fixed on the fact that the veteran didn't look like he belonged in that part of town, that he didn't fit the picture the officer had in his head of someone who might be dangerous. The veteran had faced combat zones, high-pressure situations, and life-or-death decisions. Yet here, in a simple town, he felt the sting of being judged by skin color. He knew that reacting with anger could make things worse. Years of military service had taught him discipline, patience, and control. He stayed silent for a moment, listening to the officer's accusations, letting the words come without responding immediately. He noticed the officer's body language: tight shoulders, tense jaw, a hand near the holster. It was clear that the officer was ready to escalate over something that was not true. The officer demanded that he stand in front of his truck, hands visible. The veteran complied, moving slowly and deliberately, keeping his voice calm when he spoke. He explained again why he was there, even showing the receipt from a nearby gas pump as proof he had just filled up. The officer, however, seemed determined to make this a confrontation. He asked questions that made no sense, implying involvement in crimes that were completely unrelated. The veteran answered politely, carefully, his eyes steady and calm. He had learned long ago that composure could be more powerful than aggression. A second officer arrived. Walking in from the street, he looked at the situation carefully, his eyes scanning both men. He did not intervene immediately, but stayed nearby, observing. The first officer continued, insisting that something felt off, questioning the veteran's story, asking for identification again in a manner that suggested disbelief. The veteran handed over his military ID, which was genuine, showing years of service, deployments, and honors earned in dangerous missions. The first officer barely looked at it, maintaining a tone that was more about control than truth. The veteran noticed a few bystanders, starting to film the encounter on their phones. It wasn't unusual these days, people documenting public incidents, but it added a quiet tension to the air. The officer didn't seem concerned. He seemed more interested in asserting authority. The veteran stayed calm, speaking in a steady, firm voice, explaining that he had served his country, that he was off duty, and that he had every right to be there. His words were clear, measured, and full of the quiet authority of someone who had faced far greater dangers than a tense encounter at a gas station. Minutes passed, and the situation seemed stuck in a loop. The officer continued to accuse, question, and push, refusing to accept the simple truths the veteran presented. The veteran kept responding calmly, his tone never rising, his body language relaxed but confident. He knew that losing control, even for a moment, could be used against him. He could feel the frustration building inside. The unfairness of being judged by someone who didn't see him, who only saw a stereotype. But he also knew that patience and composure were his strongest tools in this moment. The second officer finally spoke. Asking for the veteran's ID to verify the information, there was a pause, a small crack in the tension. The veteran handed over the ID once more, his expression calm, his voice steady. The first officer shifted uneasily, his insistence faltering slightly as the second officer began checking the information. The veteran remained still, aware of the stares from bystanders, aware of the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The people around seemed to sense that something significant was unfolding. Even in this ordinary place, the officer who had confronted him at first tried to regain control. But his questions were slower, less sharp, his confidence wavering. The veteran stayed calm, speaking clearly when he needed to, never raising his voice, never losing the dignity he had carried through years of service. The moment was tense, but the veteran's patience and steady presence made a difference. Even without raising a hand, without showing anger, he conveyed a quiet authority that came from experience. From facing challenges far greater than this, the crowd watched quietly, some shifting from curiosity to respect. The veteran's calm presence contrasted sharply with the officer's aggression. People began to whisper, noticing how the veteran didn't act like someone afraid or guilty, how he carried himself with the quiet strength of someone who had faced real danger and survived. There was a lesson unfolding in front of them, one not taught by words alone but by demeanor. By the power of staying composed under pressure, the veteran could feel the first officer's frustration growing. But he didn't respond to it with anger. He simply answered questions honestly, repeated truths when necessary, and let the second officer handle verification. Every word, every gesture was measured, deliberate, and full of the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your own worth and experience. He knew that the real battle here wasn't with the officer, was with the assumptions and biases that the officer carried. And the veteran's task was to show that they were wrong without creating more conflict. The sun continued to lower, casting a warm, soft light over the scene. The veteran remained calm, watching the first officer struggle with the facts. Seeing how the presence of witnesses and the second officer's verification slowly began to shift the power in the encounter. What could have become a confrontation threatening and tense was instead a demonstration of patience, dignity, and quiet strength. Every person watching could see the contrast of the officer acting on bias, the veteran acting on experience and composure. It was a lesson in human behavior. And how control and calmness often speak louder than aggression, time moved slowly in those moments. The veteran stayed relaxed, confident, and in control of his emotions. He knew that soon the truth would be revealed, that the first officer would have to confront his own behavior, and that the patience he practiced now would pay off. The crowd sensed it too, some nodding quietly, some recording silently, all watching a small ordinary scene turn into something meaningful. The veteran did not gloat, did not raise his voice, did not demand respect. He simply existed in the moment with calm authority, letting his actions speak louder than the officer's accusations. And so the afternoon continued, the veteran standing by his truck, calm, steady, waiting for the moment when the facts would be seen and the bias would begin to unravel. It was an ordinary place, a simple gas station, but the tension in the air carried the weight of much more than a parking lot encounter. It carried the weight of unfair assumptions, of years of service, of dignity under pressure, and of the quiet power of staying composed even when treated unjustly. The veteran's calm, his patience, his steady presence were the strongest statements in that moment. More powerful than any argument, any force, any threat. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be remembered, not for anger or violence, but for the quiet lesson in patience, dignity, and respect. The veteran stayed poised, knowing the truth would emerge, and when it did, the first officer would be the one learning the lesson. In that moment, he stood as a symbol of calm strength, of the power of experience, and of the enduring respect that comes from discipline and patience in the face of bias. People watched, the second officer observed, and the first officer began to realize, slowly, that he had misjudged this man. The ordinary day had turned into an extraordinary lesson, and it had only just begun. The small crowd around the gas station had grown slightly. Some were curious, others concerned, and a few were quietly filming, capturing the tense interaction that had been unfolding. The veteran stood calmly, aware of the eyes watching him, aware that every movement and word mattered. He had trained himself to stay calm in situations far more dangerous than this. But he also knew that this encounter was about more than just his dignity. It was about showing how unfair assumptions could be challenged without anger. The first officer, still standing in front of him, continued questioning, his voice sharp and impatient. He kept asking for identification, for explanations, for proof that the veteran was who he said he was. He seemed frustrated that the veteran remained calm, that he did not respond with fear or aggression. The veteran answered each question politely, clearly, without letting his emotions take over. He explained that he was just passing through, stopping briefly to rest and get some supplies before continuing his journey. He mentioned his military service again, noting that he had been stationed in various locations and had completed multiple deployments. The officer barely seemed to register the information, more focused on asserting control than seeking truth. The second officer, who had arrived earlier, observed quietly. He was patient, watching both men carefully, trying to assess the situation. The first officer seemed to grow more tense with each passing moment, as if the veteran's calm demeanor was challenging his authority. The veteran noticed this and remained still, hands relaxed at his sides, voice steady. He had learned that composure often speaks louder than words, that patience can turn a situation around when aggression only fuels conflict. A woman in the crowd took a step forward, phone in hand, quietly recording the scene. She didn't make a sound, but the presence of the camera added an unspoken pressure. The veteran understood this. In today's world, witnesses and recordings could hold people accountable in ways that words alone could not. He stayed focused, aware of the silent support of the crowd, but not letting it influence his behavior. He knew that the lesson in this moment was not about proving anything to bystanders. It was about maintaining dignity under pressure. The first officer's questions became repetitive, almost desperate. He asked why the veteran was in that part of town, why he had chosen that gas station, what his intentions were. Each question was loaded with suspicion, and the veteran answered each one honestly. He mentioned the roads he had traveled, the appointments he had scheduled, the long hours on the road. He spoke clearly and without hesitation, demonstrating that he had nothing to hide. Yet the officer remained unconvinced, bias clouding his judgment. The tension between the two men seemed to grow with each passing minute. The veteran noticed the subtle shifts in the officer's posture, the way his hand twitched near his belt, the way his eyes darted around, searching for justification for his suspicion. The veteran stayed steady, knowing that any sudden movement could escalate the situation unnecessarily. His training had taught him to assess threats carefully, to respond with control, and to use words before actions. He relied on those skills now. In a situation that was frustrating but not dangerous in the traditional sense, the second officer finally stepped forward, asking to see the veteran's identification more closely. He moved calmly, deliberately, checking the information against his system. The first officer resisted slightly, still insisting that the veteran might be deceptive. But the second officer's presence helped create a subtle shift. The crowd seemed to sense the change too. The atmosphere, which had been heavy with tension and suspicion, began to feel lighter, though the first officer's frustration was still apparent. The veteran remained composed, answering any questions from the second officer politely, clearly, and without defensiveness. He explained his military background in more detail, highlighting the discipline and training that had shaped him. He spoke not to impress, but to clarify the truth. He knew that bias often comes from ignorance or lack of understanding, and he aimed to correct it without aggression. The crowd listened quietly, many nodding slightly, as they recognized the calm authority in his words and presence. The first officer, realizing that the second officer was verifying the veteran's identity, started to lose some of his confidence. His questions slowed, his voice softened, but he still clung to the idea that something was suspicious. The veteran stayed silent for a moment, letting the officer process, not pushing, not reacting. He knew that patience was the key here, that proving himself through composure was more effective than confrontation. A few people in the crowd whispered to each other, commenting on how the veteran handled the situation. They noted the contrast between the officer's tension and the veteran's calm. Recognizing that experience and self-control can make a powerful statement, the veteran continued speaking clearly when necessary, repeating truths as needed, and keeping his demeanor steady. He knew that the real lesson in this encounter would unfold not through force or anger, but through presence, patience, and dignity. The second officer completed the verification and returned the identification, confirming that the veteran's credentials were authentic. The first officer's expression shifted, a flicker of realization passing across his face, though he did not admit fault outright. The veteran stayed composed, his tone calm, showing no sign of triumph or anger. He understood that allowing the first officer to save face, even partially, was important for de-escalation. The crowd, sensing the shift, remained quiet but attentive. Time seemed to stretch in the late afternoon, with the sun casting long shadows across the lot. The veteran's calm presence continued to dominate the scene, creating a contrast that was impossible to ignore. The first officer shifted uneasily, aware that the bias that had guided his actions was being challenged, but unsure how to respond. The veteran spoke briefly about respect and fairness, about how assumptions can hurt, and how discipline and patience are often the strongest tools in resolving conflict. His words were measured, deliberate, and full of quiet authority. The crowd, though still quiet, began to show subtle signs of support. Some nodded, others whispered softly to one another. A few more people quietly began recording, capturing not only the tension, but the veteran's calm and composed demeanor. The veteran remained aware of these observations, but he did not alter his behavior for them. His focus remained on the interaction itself, on responding truthfully and calmly, and on demonstrating the quiet power of dignity. The first officer's repeated attempts at questioning became less frequent, less confident. The second officer continued to observe, ready to intervene if needed, but also allowing the veteran to manage the situation through composure. The veteran remained steady, answering any necessary questions, but never raising his voice or reacting with hostility. He knew that his calmness was teaching a lesson in itself, showing how control and patience can overcome bias and assumption. Minutes passed, and the tension slowly began to ease. The first officer, confronted with the facts and the veteran's unwavering calm, began to realize that he had misjudged the situation. He did not apologize immediately, but the rigidity in his posture softened, his tone lost some of its sharpness. The veteran remained steady, showing that the real power in this encounter was not in asserting authority, but in maintaining composure and dignity under pressure. The second officer finally spoke quietly to the first officer, suggesting that they de-escalate and acknowledge the facts. The first officer hesitated, but the veteran's calm presence made the decision easier. The crowd remained quiet, watching, sensing that the confrontation was nearing its end. The veteran stood poised, confident and steady, demonstrating the quiet strength that had carried him through dangerous situations in his past service. The first officer could no longer deny the truth, and the lesson was beginning to sink in. The veteran's approach throughout the encounter had been simple but powerful: honesty, patience, and composure. He had not raised his voice, he had not threatened, and he had not acted aggressively. Yet his presence commanded respect, and the facts of his service were undeniable. The crowd, the second officer, and even the first officer began to understand that the real lesson was about dignity under pressure, about responding to bias with calm authority rather than anger. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower, the situation was slowly coming to a resolution. The veteran remained calm, aware that this encounter, while stressful, had been an opportunity to show how fairness and patience can triumph over assumption and bias. The first officer, though still uncomfortable, was now in a position to reflect on his behavior. The second officer, witnessing the veteran's composed handling of the situation, seemed to gain a new appreciation for the strength that comes from discipline and self-control. In the quiet moments that followed, the veteran continued to answer any lingering questions politely and clearly. The crowd began to disperse slowly, some approaching to thank him quietly, some simply leaving with a new perspective on how bias and judgment can affect ordinary interactions. The veteran remained humble, his focus on the principles of respect, patience, and dignity that he had maintained throughout. He knew that the true lesson was not about proving himself to the first officer or the crowd, but about demonstrating that composure and honesty can diffuse tension and reveal the truth, even in unfair situations. By the time he was ready to step back into his truck, the tension in the air had shifted noticeably. The first officer, still uneasy, was left to confront his own assumptions and biases. The second officer offered a quiet nod of respect. The veteran climbed into his vehicle, taking a deep breath, and prepared to continue his journey. He had turned a tense encounter into a moment of clarity. It's not through aggression or confrontation, but through patience, honesty, and unwavering calm. The gas station, once an ordinary stop, had become a small stage for a lesson in dignity, respect, and the quiet power of human composure. The first officer stood awkwardly, his posture slightly stiff as he tried to regain a sense of authority that was slipping from his grasp. The veteran remained calm, hands at his sides, his voice quiet but firm whenever he spoke. He had faced moments in his life far more dangerous than this, and he knew that control came from patience, not aggression. The second officer had finished verifying the veteran's identification and credentials, confirming that everything he had said was true. The tension in the air shifted subtly as the first officer realized that his assumptions were wrong. The veteran took a deep breath and spoke in a steady, calm tone. He explained that he understood how misunderstandings could happen, but that assumptions based on appearance could be harmful. He spoke about his service in the Navy, the deployments he had completed, and the missions that required trust, discipline, and teamwork. He didn't speak to impress the officers or the crowd, but to clarify the truth and illustrate the consequences of judging someone without knowing them. His words were measured and honest, carrying a quiet authority that only came from experience. The crowd around them had grown slightly, though most people stayed at a safe distance, watching silently. Some were recording on their phones, not to provoke, but to document a moment that was both tense and revealing. The veteran noticed them, acknowledging their presence with calm awareness, but he did not let it change his focus. He understood that the real lesson here was about respect and fairness, and it was important to handle the situation with dignity rather than frustration. The first officer shifted nervously, eyes flicking between the veteran, the second officer, and the growing crowd. His repeated questions had begun to lose their sharpness. He no longer spoke with the same confidence as before. The veteran maintained a steady posture, answering questions clearly and calmly. He explained that he had nothing to hide, that he was simply traveling through, and that his service had taught him the importance of patience and respect. Even in uncomfortable situations, the second officer stepped closer, speaking quietly to the first officer. He reminded him that the veteran's credentials had been verified, that there was no reason for further suspicion. The first officer hesitated, clearly struggling with the realization that his actions had been guided by bias rather than fact. The veteran remained silent for a moment, letting the officers exchange words, showing that he was composed and confident without needing to intervene further. His presence alone spoke volumes. Some members of the crowd whispered to one another, noting the contrast between the veteran's calm demeanor and the first officer's tense, uncertain posture. It was clear to them that this was a moment of reflection, a subtle lesson in the power of composure and dignity. The veteran continued to speak occasionally, clarifying facts and responding politely to questions. But he never raised his voice or allowed frustration to seep into his tone. He had learned through years of service that calm authority was far more powerful than anger. The first officer finally took a step back, his body language less aggressive. He seemed to recognize, at least partially, the error in his assumptions. The veteran spoke briefly about fairness and how important it is to judge people by their actions, not appearances. He highlighted that everyone deserved respect, and that biases could lead to unnecessary conflict or harm. His words were simple, natural, and human, yet carried a weight that was undeniable. Even the first officer could not ignore the truth in them. The crowd's attention remained fixed on the scene. There was an unspoken understanding that this was more than just an encounter at a gas station. It was a demonstration of patience, dignity, and the quiet strength that comes from experience. The veteran's ability to remain composed under pressure was teaching a lesson in ways that words alone could not. People began to nod quietly, some whispering affirmations to each other. Recognizing the courage it took to handle the situation without confrontation, the second officer continued to stand nearby, offering support when necessary but allowing the veteran to manage the situation through calm authority. He seemed to understand the impact of the veteran's approach. Observing how the first officer's demeanor had shifted from aggressive to uncertain, the veteran's quiet confidence was creating a ripple effect. Showing that composure and honesty could overcome suspicion and bias, without the need for force or argument, the first officer cleared his throat, struggling to maintain a sense of control. The veteran remained calm, observing, but not pressing, letting the officer reflect on his actions. His posture was steady, his gaze firm, but not intimidating. He knew that demonstrating dignity under pressure was often the strongest statement one could make. The crowd sensed this, and the atmosphere began to feel less tense. Though the memory of the initial confrontation still hung in the air, the veteran spoke again, this time addressing the first officer directly, but without accusation. He explained that many people face judgment based on appearance or background, and that it can be harmful and unfair. He spoke from personal experience, sharing how it felt to be treated as suspicious despite having served his country with honor. His voice was calm, his words deliberate, and his presence commanding in a way that was not aggressive, but deeply persuasive. The first officer shifted uncomfortably. Glancing at the second officer and the crowd, he seemed to understand, at least partially, that his actions had been unfair. The veteran did not push him to admit fault, but allowed his calm demeanor and clear words to convey the truth. The lesson was unfolding quietly, without confrontation or anger. The veteran had taken a tense, potentially volatile situation and turned it into a moment of reflection and learning. The crowd remained attentive, silently absorbing the unfolding scene. Some people had tears in their eyes, moved by the veteran's calm strength and the injustice he had faced. Others were nodding quietly, recognizing the importance of addressing bias and the value of dignity under pressure. The veteran continued to answer questions politely, reinforcing the truth without raising his voice or showing frustration. He knew that the real power in this encounter came from his composure, not his words alone. Minutes passed, and the first officer's posture softened further. He was no longer leaning forward aggressively. His voice had lost its edge, and he seemed more willing to listen than to accuse. The veteran remained steady, not gloating, not reacting with anger. He understood that the lesson was not about punishing the officer, but about demonstrating the strength that comes from patience, honesty, and dignity. The crowd could see this, and the atmosphere began to shift. Tension giving way to quiet respect. The second officer quietly approached the first officer, suggesting that they de-escalate and acknowledge the facts. The first officer hesitated, but the veteran's calm presence made the decision easier. The crowd remained silent, observing the subtle change. The veteran's ability to maintain control and dignity had created a situation where reflection and learning were possible. The first officer, confronted with undeniable truth, began to understand the impact of bias and the importance of treating others with fairness. The veteran spoke briefly about the values that guided him. Throughout his service, respect, patience, and responsibility. He highlighted how these principles were more important in everyday life than in combat, and how applying them could prevent unnecessary conflict. His words were simple, natural, and human, yet carried weight that resonated with everyone present. Even the first officer, still uneasy, seemed to recognize the validity of the veteran's message. The crowd's attention remained focused, sensing that the confrontation was reaching its resolution. The veteran continued to speak occasionally, responding to questions and clarifying facts, but never raising his voice. His calm authority was undeniable, a testament to the discipline and experience gained through years of service. The first officer's behavior had softened significantly. It was clear that the lesson in patience and dignity was being learned, even if silently. The afternoon sun continued to sink, casting warm light over the scene. The veteran remained composed, aware of the eyes upon him, but not distracted by them. He knew that the real lesson was not about proving himself to the first officer or the crowd, but about demonstrating how bias could be challenged through calm, honest, and dignified behavior. The tension in the air had shifted, replaced by a sense of reflection and quiet respect. As the veteran prepared to step back into his truck, the first officer took a tentative step toward acknowledgement. He did not speak immediately, but his body language indicated recognition of the veteran's composure and the truth of his words. The second officer nodded quietly, signaling approval. The crowd remained attentive, sensing that the encounter, though still unresolved in some ways, had imparted a subtle yet powerful lesson about respect, fairness. In the quiet strength of patience under pressure, the veteran climbed into his truck, taking a deep breath and letting the calmness he had maintained throughout settle within him. The encounter had not ended with confrontation or conflict, but with the demonstration of dignity, honesty, and strength. The first officer, left to reflect on his assumptions and behavior, had witnessed firsthand the impact of composure and respect. The second officer had seen a lesson in how patience and calm authority can guide tense situations. Toward understanding and reflection, the crowd began to disperse slowly, some approaching to thank the veteran quietly, some leaving with a new perspective on how assumptions and bias can affect ordinary encounters. The veteran remained humble, focused on the principles that had guided him throughout his life and service. He knew that the real lesson extended beyond this gas station, beyond the officers and the crowd, into the everyday interactions of people who faced unfair judgment or assumptions. The veteran started the engine of his truck, ready to continue his journey. He had turned a tense, potentially harmful situation into a moment of clarity and learning, not through force or anger, but through calm, composed, and dignified behavior. The first officer remained in the lot, left to reflect on his actions, while the second officer offered a quiet nod of respect. The veteran drove away, carrying with him the quiet strength and discipline that had defined his service and that had transformed an ordinary encounter into an extraordinary lesson for those who had witnessed it. The sun had lowered further, bathing the small-town gas station in warm, soft light, but the air was still thick with tension. The first officer had stepped back slightly, still trying to gather himself. Now the second officer remained nearby, quietly observing. The veteran stood tall, calm, and composed, his presence commanding attention without aggression. He could feel the eyes of the small crowd on him, yet he did not let it sway his focus. Every movement, every word mattered in this delicate balance. He decided to speak again, his voice steady, clear, and measured. He addressed the first officer directly, but without accusation. He explained what it meant to serve the country, to risk life and safety for others, and how such service comes with a profound sense of responsibility and discipline. He spoke not to boast, but to illustrate the kind of training, patience, respect that had been ingrained in him through years of service. His words were simple, yet they carried weight and authority that was impossible to ignore. The first officer's posture remained tense, but there was a flicker of awareness in his eyes. He seemed to realize slowly that his actions were being seen for what they truly were: biased, unfair, and unnecessary. The veteran continued, explaining how assumptions based on appearance or skin color could lead to misunderstandings and even harm. He shared how, in uniform or civilian life, people often face judgment simply for who they are rather than what they do. His tone was calm but firm, filled with the quiet power of someone who had faced real danger and come through it with dignity. The crowd around them had grown slightly, though most stayed back, quietly watching. Some were recording on their phones, capturing not confrontation, but the veteran's composed and measured way of handling the situation. There was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. The tension, once heavy and oppressive, began to lighten, replaced with a sense of respect and reflection. People began to whisper to one another, acknowledging the veteran's calm authority and the lesson he was teaching without raising his voice or showing anger. The veteran spoke about respect, how it is earned not by force or intimidation, but by actions, patience, and integrity. He explained that discipline and composure, learned through service and experience, were not just for dangerous situations, but for everyday life. He highlighted that responding to bias and assumptions with calmness and truth could teach more than confrontation ever could. His words were simple and relatable, yet they carried the depth of someone who had lived through challenges most people could not imagine. The first officer shifted uneasily. Glancing at the second officer and then at the veteran, he seemed to recognize, at least partially, the gap between his assumptions and reality. The veteran did not push him to admit fault. Instead, he allowed the lesson to unfold through his presence, his steady demeanor, and the truth of his words. The second officer nodded slightly, acknowledging that the veteran's approach was effective. Showing the strength of patience and dignity, a few members of the crowd quietly approached, expressing their gratitude for the veteran's service and the calm way he handled the situation. They whispered thanks, some offering kind words, others simply nodding. The veteran acknowledged them politely, but remained focused on the interaction with the officers. He understood that the lesson he was imparting was broader than this single encounter. It was about challenging bias and demonstrating dignity under pressure. The first officer, now visibly more uncertain, took a hesitant step back. He no longer spoke with the aggressive tone he had earlier. His questions had slowed, and he seemed unsure how to respond. The veteran remained composed, speaking when necessary, clarifying facts, and sharing insights about respect, fairness, and integrity. His calmness contrasted sharply with the first officer's unease, making the lesson in patience and dignity. It's clear to everyone present. The second officer finally spoke quietly to the first officer, suggesting they de-escalate and acknowledge the facts. The first officer hesitated, but the veteran's calm and authoritative presence made the suggestion easier to accept. The crowd remained quiet, observing the subtle shifts. The veteran's patience and composed demeanor were having the intended effect, showing that strength often comes from restraint and truth rather than force or intimidation. The veteran continued to speak briefly about his experiences, emphasizing the importance of empathy and understanding in interactions with others. He shared how bias and assumptions could hurt people, and how responding with calmness and truth could change perceptions. His words were simple, human, and relatable. It carried the weight of someone who had lived through challenges far greater than this encounter. The crowd listened quietly, some nodding, some whispering to one another. Recognizing the significance of what was happening, the first officer's posture softened further, his tone less harsh. He began to realize that his actions had been guided by bias rather than fact. The veteran maintained his calm, answering any remaining questions politely, never raising his voice or showing frustration. He knew that the true lesson was unfolding through his composed presence and honest words. The crowd could see it too. The atmosphere continued to shift from tension to reflection. The veteran emphasized that true strength comes from patience and integrity, not aggression or intimidation. He explained how discipline, respect, and honesty guide meaningful actions and create trust. The first officer, confronted with the undeniable truth and the veteran's unwavering calm, began to reflect on his behavior. The second officer observed, recognizing the power of the veteran's approach and the lesson being taught without confrontation or anger. The small crowd remained attentive, understanding that this was more than just a routine encounter. It was a demonstration of dignity and strength under pressure. The veteran continued to respond politely to questions, clarifying facts and sharing insights. His calm and composed demeanor served as a living example of the lesson he wanted to impart, that patience, integrity, and honesty can overcome bias and misunderstanding without aggression. The first officer, now noticeably less tense, seemed to acknowledge, at least internally, The impact of the veteran's words and presence. The veteran did not demand recognition or apology, but allowed his composed demeanor and the truth of his experiences to guide the lesson. The second officer quietly nodded, showing appreciation for the way the veteran had handled the situation, demonstrating that calm authority can lead to understanding and reflection. The veteran spoke briefly about fairness, respect, and the importance of judging people by their actions rather than their appearance. He highlighted that assumptions based on bias could cause unnecessary conflict and harm, while calm and composed responses could transform tense situations into opportunities for understanding. His words were simple, direct, and human, resonating with everyone present, including the first officer who had initially acted on bias. The afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the lot. The veteran remained composed, calm, and steady, aware of the significance of the moment. The first officer, confronted with the facts and the veteran's composed demeanor, began to reflect more deeply on his actions. The second officer observed, understanding that the encounter had become a subtle but powerful lesson in patience, dignity, and respect. The veteran spoke once more, emphasizing the importance of empathy, understanding, and self-control in interactions with others. He explained that true strength lies in patience and integrity, not aggression or intimidation. The first officer's demeanor softened further. His voice lost its earlier edge, and he seemed to realize the depth of his mistake. The veteran's calm presence had turned a tense situation into a moment of reflection and learning. The crowd remained quiet, observing the interaction with a sense of respect and understanding. Some whispered to one another, acknowledging the veteran's composure and the subtle but important lesson he had imparted. The veteran continued to answer questions politely, clarifying facts and sharing insights without showing frustration or anger. His calm authority was evident to everyone present, demonstrating the power of patience, dignity, and honesty. The first officer, confronted with undeniable truth and the veteran's unwavering composure, finally took a tentative step toward acknowledgement. He did not speak immediately, but seemed to understand, at least internally, the importance of the lesson. The second officer quietly nodded in agreement, recognizing the veteran's approach and the impact it had on the situation. The small crowd continued to watch, appreciating the subtle but powerful demonstration of dignity and strength. The veteran remained composed, knowing that the lesson extended beyond this encounter. His calm and steady demeanor had challenged bias, demonstrated integrity, and shown how patience and honesty could transform a tense situation into an opportunity for reflection and understanding. The first officer, now left to consider his actions, had witnessed firsthand the power of dignity under pressure, while the second officer and the crowd observed a profound example of calm authority and human respect. As the veteran prepared to leave, he remained humble, acknowledging the small gestures of thanks from some members of the crowd, but keeping his focus on the principles that had guided him throughout his life and service. He understood that the real lesson was not about punishment or confrontation, but about demonstrating the strength and effectiveness of patience, honesty, and dignity in challenging situations. With a final steady breath, he moved to continue his journey, leaving a quiet but lasting impression on everyone who had witnessed the encounter.